Good evening. My name is Benjamin Black, and this is my Teach 1 for my HAP 360B03 presentation on the participatory vendor selection process. Because it's an extensive section, though, I will be focusing on one particular step, the second step on how to do one-on-one interviews. This is probably the most involved part and the most time-consuming, and is a process in and of itself. Once we've established all the decision makers and stakeholders in step 1, we can begin the interviews. But why do these interviews matter? Despite the time it takes, every piece of information we get from the client is important. It's much more than just finding out what they want, but their reasonings for it. But since it's a process, we'll go into the first step. Part 1. Introduce yourself and your purpose. You need to be brief in your introduction. Just get to the point, tell them what it is that you're doing and what you expect from the interview. As the analyst, you should set the pace of the questions and make sure that client or the decision maker understands what it is you're looking for. One of the big flaws in this process is if you ask the wrong question, it may lead to unnecessary discussions on the decision maker's background. We don't need to know their background when it comes to this process. We just need to understand what it is they need and why they need it. Part 2, ask the decision maker to introduce themselves. Have them introduce themselves by describing their relevant experiences. While it is important to have a little bit of background on them, it's not relevant to what you as the analyst is trying to accomplish. Avoid having them go about their accomplishments, what they've achieved, as it's not relevant to the discussion. Just have them focus on the job they do, the experiences they've had, and ways you can improve that. So that way you can understand how to improve their situations and make a better choice for what kind of system they want to go with. Part 3, start with tangible examples. When you're talking to the decision maker, you need to find out what real-world experiences they've had. You shouldn't be afraid to ask them if they've had negative experiences, and you should compare those with other experiences you've had for contrast. By doing this, they can come to a better understanding of what they might need in the future and ways to avoid the negative experiences that they've had. Do avoid expressing your own ideas as an analyst. While you might have ways to fix their problems, you still need to understand where they're coming from. Listen to the decision maker and make sure you understand what they want specifically. That way you can avoid adding something that might prove to be unnecessary. Part 4. Arrange the attributes in a hierarchy, as putting together a hierarchy can promote completeness and simplify the tracking of the attributes needed. You have to make sure, though, when going over everything you've discussed with the decision maker, that all the attributes are relevant. You also need to make sure that you're sorting it in a proper hierarchy. For example, let's talk about costs. You can't just say, money is important. You have to build a hierarchy in order to determine which is more important, of purchasing equipment, the cost of maintenance to maintain that equipment, or the cost of impact on efficiency to make sure that the system is running when the decision maker needs it. But after you're done with that, you go to part 5. Assess possible levels for each attribute. There are 3 key steps in assessing the levels of each attribute. You need to define the range of the attribute by selecting the best and worst levels, find some intermediate levels between the best and worst, and then filling out other possible levels so that the listing of levels is exhausted and capable of covering all possible vendors. When you're determining the range, you don't want to go for simple things like what is cheaper and what is more expensive. You need to look at some of the more physical processes. For example, When a client is using a piece of software, they might ask how much time does it take to complete a task. For the best, they could say, oh, it only took me an average of 2 minutes to recall some information. And on the worst, it says, well, I find that using this piece of software takes about 6 minutes. So we found, at that point, we found our best and worst. Then we need to determine the intermediate levels. And well, so that means asking, when using this piece of software, we found that it's about using 3 minutes. When using another piece of software, we found that it took about 4 minutes. This is what you as the analyst need to point out to give them the possibilities. And when it comes to other intermediates, as the analyst, you can come up with certain things that the clients themselves may not have thought of. But once all the information is collected, then you got to start rating the information using the double anchor estimation method. Now, it's come off as a bit intimidating, but it's actually quite simple once you realize it. When you've looked at the attributes, you have to rank them, usually with a 0 to 100, with 0 being the worst and 100 being the best. So we'll look at saying 2 minutes is a 90 and 6 minutes is a 10. And 3 to 4 minutes would be about a 50. What we'd want to do is using the standardization. We have our regular rings, which represent X. Then we have the minimum and maximum, minimum being 10 and maximum being 90. And that will give us our standardization. So 10 becomes 0, 90 becomes 100, and 60 minus 10 divided by 90 minus 10 be 50 over 80 would be about a 62. Once we have these rankings, then we can move on to part 6. Assess relative importance of the attributes. This will help us determine the weight of these attributes to find out which is the most important that we need to address and which is the least important that we can put on the wayside. So the way this is done, now there are many different ways you can address an attribute's importance, but the most common way is the additive approach. The way that works is you identify the lowest attribute and give it a score. For example, when we look back, we said taking 6 minutes would rank a score of 10. After that, though, then we want to look at the next attribute along the way. So you said when it goes to 3 or 4 minutes, we say how much more important is this? And the client can give you an estimation saying, well, that's 2 times more important, that's 3 times more important. Keep calculating from there to assess the times for each attribute. After that, you can use the equation to determine what the weight is, usually somewhere between 0 and 1. But after that's done, and you've determined the weight of each process, before you start analyzing all the data, you need to have one more group meeting. This would allow for every decision maker to come together and choose on a vendor. This may come off as odd because you'll have to explain a lot of things to them, and to them, they might not understand the process you as an analyst is about to go through. But it will help lead to a correct choice as you can get the feedback, possible consensus. Once that's determined, then in the grand scheme of things of choosing a vendor, then you could have an official group meeting with all the other vendors. But this concludes this part of one-on-one interviews to analyze a participatory vendor selection. Thank you.